Can you believe the terror? Imagine waking up in a world where the very ground beneath your feet had been stolen, where a foreign tyrant now claimed the sun, the moon, and every muddy road leading to your village. This isn't just history. This is the true story of how William the Conqueror didn't just win a battle. He unleashed a psychological weapon so massive, so terrifying, that it fundamentally reshaped the soul of an entire nation for 400 years.
We are talking about the age of the fortress, the iron fist of medieval control, the monumental structures of stone and fear that we call castles. But you need to forget everything you think you know about cute little turrets and charming historical ruins. These were not tourist attractions. They were monstrous, operational killing machines, built by men who understood that fear was cheaper than an army.
The year is 1066. The Battle of Hastings is over, but the war for England has just begun. William the Bastard, now William the Conqueror, looks across the defeated landscape and realizes one terrifying truth. He holds the crown, but he does not hold the people. The Anglo-Saxons were stubborn, resilient, and they were preparing to rise up in a tide of localized, brutal rebellion. A catastrophe no one saw coming, except perhaps the sharpest mind in Europe, William's. He knew he couldn't occupy every village with 1,000 men. That was impossible. He needed a way to project absolute, inescapable power across a vast, hostile territory using minimal manpower. His solution? The most ingenious, rapid construction project the Western world had ever witnessed. He began building power centers, castles, at a speed that defies modern logistics. Forget months, forget years. They needed to be up now. Within 2 decades, over 500 of these brutal monuments erupted from the English soil, each one a declaration of permanent, unyielding subjugation. The initial phase was shockingly simple, yet ruthlessly effective. The motte and bailey. Think of it as the ultimate medieval speed build. Men, forced labor, lots of dirt, and sharp stakes. They would dig a massive ditch, piling the earth high to create the motte, a steep, artificial hill, sometimes 100 feet tall. Atop this motte, protected by the vertical climb and the sharp spikes, they erected a wooden tower, the first true Norman stronghold. This tower was terrifyingly high, offering a commanding view and an arrow-proof vantage point. Below, the bailey, the courtyard, was secured by a palisade fence, housing the garrison, the horses, and the essential supplies.
This wasn't just defense. It was a visible insult, a permanent reminder that the Normans were watching you from above. Every time an Anglo-Saxon peasant looked up, they saw the shadow of the French sword hanging over their heads. They understood instantly that resistance meant certain death, delivered from an unassailable height.
But the wooden era was just the beginning, the proof of concept. Wood burns. William's successors understood that true, eternal dominion required something harder, something that defied fire and siege, stone. And this transition from temporary wooden forts to the colossal, immortal stone keeps, like the White Tower of London, is where the real madness begins.
The White Tower, the ultimate symbol of Norman brutality, was not just a building. It was an act of national humiliation. Erected right in the heart of the defeated city, it was a massive, square, unyielding block of power, its walls 15 feet thick at the base. It was designed to tell Londoners, "We are here forever." Can you imagine the labor? The sheer logistical nightmare of hauling millions of tons of stone, often imported from France or dug from quarries hundreds of miles away, using nothing but ox carts and human muscle? This level of resource drain was intentional. It didn't just provide security. It deliberately bankrupted the local economy and kept the native population too busy surviving to revolt. These stone keeps weren't comfortable palaces. They were cold, damp, dark, multi-story bunkers designed primarily for war. The few small windows were slit-like, not for viewing the landscape, but for firing arrows while minimizing exposure. Every architectural choice was a military decision, a calculated move in a centuries-long chess game against the English soil itself. And here is the dark secret they don't teach you in school. The true genius of the early stone castle wasn't its height, but its strategic placement. Every major castle, from Dover to Windsor, was built to dominate key geographical choke points, river crossings, strategic harbors, or crucial road junctions. They were geographical anchors, ensuring that commerce, communication, and military movement could only happen with Norman permission. We are entering a world where survival depended on understanding angles of fire, the depth of the moat, and the sheer velocity of a falling rock. We are stepping into the crucible, where the most advanced military technology of the age met the deepest wells of human ambition, paranoia, and fear. Prepare yourself, because we are about to unlock the terrifying secrets hidden behind the 15-foot thick walls of the greatest medieval castles ever built. This is not a history lesson. This is a siege. But before we dive into the catastrophic details of siege warfare and the horrors of the oubliette, we must first confront the terrifying speed of construction. The earthworks themselves, the mottes, required teams of hundreds of men moving mountains of soil in terrifying silence. It was forced labor on a scale previously unknown to England, designed to break spirits as well as break ground. It was a revolution carved in earth and blood, setting the stage for the next 4 centuries of royal drama, betrayal, and unspeakable violence. Get ready for the deep dive into the stone heart of medieval power. The year is 1067, and the air still smells of burnt Saxon thatch and fresh blood. William the Conqueror, the duke who became king, knew that victory on the battlefield was just the opening act. The real subjugation required an architectural declaration,
a physical chokehold on the very soul of the land.
The English, stripped of their lords and their liberty, watched in horrified disbelief as the invaders unleashed the Motte and Bailey, a concept so simple, so rudimentary, yet so brutally effective that it transformed the landscape overnight. This was not high engineering. This was military speed dating with disaster.
These first fortifications were built at a terrifying pace, designed to be functional within weeks, not years, throwing up immediate symbols of Norman authority wherever resistance flickered or vital roads intersected.
They were the shock troops of construction, requiring nothing more than manpower, shovels, and fear. The construction method itself was a profound act of humiliation and control.
Imagine hundreds of men, forced laborers, the defeated population, their hands raw and blistered, digging a monumental ditch, the Bailey enclosure, and piling the excavated earth into a massive artificial hill, the Motte. Some of these earthen mounds rose 50, 60, even 80 feet into the sky, commanding the horizon and mocking the flat, open fields that had once belonged to the free. They were literally burying the old world to build the new one on its corpse.
This work was relentless, driven by the crack of the whip and the constant chilling presence of armed Norman knights watching from the quickly erected wooden tower, the keep, atop the Motte.
The wooden structures themselves were deceptively simple, often assembled from prefabricated timber brought across the channel, allowing a new fortress to spring up, a visible scar of conquest, within weeks. By 1086, barely 20 years after Hastings, William's men had dotted the map with well over 1,000 of these terrifying, temporary strongholds. Each one was a checkpoint, a tax office, and a prison, all rolled into one jagged wooden structure, asserting absolute, undeniable control over every vital route, every resource, and every river crossing. This was the genius of Norman occupation: rapid, decentralized terror. It meant that no matter where you stood in England or the contested marches of Wales, you were never far from the shadow of the man who had defeated your king. The Motte and Bailey was the provisional government of fear, a necessary stage until the true, eternal declaration of power could be mounted. But wood burns, and William was planning for eternity, not just the next decade. He understood that true, lasting power could not rest on mud and timber, vulnerable to fire, decay, and the long memory of rebellion. It needed granite. It needed weight. It needed a structure so colossal, so geometrically perfect, that it would stand as a permanent, cold monument to Saxon failure and Norman destiny.
This, comrades, is the genesis of the great stone keep. The Motte and Bailey were the warning shots. The stone keep was the executioner's axe, dropped with bone-shattering finality onto the conquered earth.
The immediate goal was to replace the most vulnerable and strategically crucial wooden castles with immense stone behemoths, structures built to withstand not just siege engines, but the crushing weight of 5 centuries of time itself.
Think of the White Tower in London, the Tower of Terror. Its construction began almost immediately, a stark, pale geometric threat rising from the heart of the defeated capital, designed not just to defend, but to paralyze the imagination of anyone who dared look upon it.
These capes were miracles of forced engineering, 4-sided megaliths, often 50 to 100 feet high, with walls sometimes 15 feet thick at the base, defying any attempts at undermining. Forget the round, flowing shapes of earlier defenses. The Norman keep was all sharp angles, rigid geometry, and brutal verticality, a physical manifestation of feudal law, imposing order on chaos.
The logistics were nightmarish. Quarries were opened across the land, and thousands upon thousands of heavy stone, limestone, granite, ragstone, had to be hauled, shaped, and lifted without modern machinery, powered only by oxen, rope, and the endless, forced labor of the subjugated English. Every single block, every precisely fitted corner, represented stolen resources and the unwritten decree that the Saxon life was now merely a tool for the Norman master. These castles were literally built on the backs of the defeated. Their sheer presence was a psychological weapon more potent than any arrow. They were too large to ignore, too strong to breach, and too permanent to hope away. They spoke a language of absolute, divine right that the English had never heard before. From Rochester to Colchester, from Dover to Newcastle, these colossal stone fortresses were not just military bases. They were the new centers of administrative and judicial control, radiating power, taxes, and fear across the provinces. The massive scale served a secondary, critical purpose. These keeps were also luxurious, protected residences for the new Norman lords, who lived in almost imaginable splendor, while the native populace starved outside the curtain walls. The keep became the ultimate status symbol, defining who ruled and who served. The higher the keep, the deeper the shame felt by those forced to look up at its battlements. The thicker the wall, the more solid the chains of servitude. This monumental transition from temporary earthworks to eternal stone was the true conquest. It cemented the rule of the French-speaking elite and established a new class system where birthright dictated everything. The castles of England and Wales became the silent sentinels of this new, violent order, massive stone fists clenching the land. But beneath those impenetrable walls, resentment was boiling, and the construction of these fortresses would soon become the focus of bitter, desperate rebellions. The stage is set, the massive stone foundations laid, for centuries of siege warfare and royal bloodshed that would define the medieval age. Get ready, because the walls of these keeps hold secrets far darker than just defense. The Motte and Bailey was the warning shot. The stone keep was the executioner's axe, driven deep into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. A declaration that the fleeting era of timber forts was over, replaced by an eternity of stone tyranny. These colossal, intimidating blocks of masonry weren't meant to be temporary. They were meant to stand until the end of time, monuments to William the Conqueror's absolute, terrifying victory, and the relentless power of the new regime. They projected permanence in a way no wooden palisade ever could, solidifying the idea in the mind of the subjugated that this domination was not a temporary invasion, but a fundamental, irreversible change to the landscape itself, both physical and political. Look closely at the White Tower in London, or the colossal ruins of Rochester or Dover Castle. These keeps rise 80, 90, sometimes 100 feet straight up, sheer cliffs of rock, defying gravity and human hope with their imposing verticality. This wasn't merely a byproduct of good engineering. This extreme height was deliberate, maximizing the psychological pressure and ensuring that any attacker had to face the daunting prospect of scaling a man-made mountain while being showered with deadly projectiles from above. The mere sight of such a massive structure was enough to crush the spirit of rebellion before the first arrow was even loosed. Forget ground floor entry. That weakness was reserved for peasant shacks and flimsy Saxon halls. The true, defensible entrance to a Norman stone keep was always situated on the first or second floor, accessible only by a retractable wooden staircase or a narrow, heavily fortified stone tunnel known as the forebuilding, sometimes called the ravelins. Imagine trying to storm that entry. It was a calculated choke point, a deadly bottleneck where attackers were funneled into a confined space, overlooked by archers and ready to be targeted through openings known as murder holes, which rained boiling water, hot sand, or heavy stones down upon anyone foolish enough to try and penetrate the keep's interior. You weren't attacking a simple wall. You were attempting to climb a vertical fortress where every single architectural detail was a weapon, and every advantage belonged to the Norman lord holding the high ground, dictating the terms of engagement and ensuring maximum casualty rates for the enemy. But the terror wasn't just external. Step inside if you dared survive the entrance, and you would find yourself in the Great Hall, usually positioned high up, strategically basking in the filtered sunlight that streamed through narrow, vertical windows that were less about illumination and more about providing tactical arrow slits. This hall was the undeniable heart of the new regime, the center of all administrative, legal, and military power. This is where the Norman Baron, the newly installed tyrannical overseer, held court, dining on imported fine meats and silver plate, surrounded by his heavily armed retinue, while the defeated Saxon populace starved just outside the impregnable walls. It was a chilling, calculated, daily performance of dominion, a theatrical show designed to humiliate the local populace and assert total, unquestionable authority over their land, their laws, and their very lives. The architecture became the stage for subjugation. Yet beneath the pomp and the grandeur of the great hall, shielded from the light and the glory, lay the true, horrifying secret of the keep, the subterranean nightmare known as the dungeon, or worse, the oubliette. The very name, derived from the French oublier, means literally a place to forget. These were not airy prison cells with bars and views of the courtyard. They were dark, damp, often bell-shaped pits, deep in the bedrock, sometimes accessible only by a tiny hole in the ceiling, a terrifying bucket drop into eternal, suffocating darkness. If you were unfortunate enough to be thrown into the oubliette, the goal wasn't just imprisonment. The goal was erasure. You were forgotten by God and man, left to slowly starve in the cold, thick shadow of the conqueror's power, becoming a silent, decomposing engine of compliance and warning to all others who might dare defy the new order. How did these monsters of masonry rise so fast, changing the entire face of the English landscape within a single generation? A Herculean feat of medieval engineering. The answer is brutally simple and profoundly tragic. Brutal, non-stop forced labor. We are talking about massive, relentless quarrying operations, forcing the defeated populace, the very men whose families would be ruled by the resulting keep, to haul thousands upon thousands of heavy stone across miles of rugged terrain, often without adequate food or rest. This was punishment dressed up as construction. The sheer physical toll was part of the ongoing conquest, a non-lethal attrition designed to break the Saxon spirit through back-breaking, endless toil. The mortar, the very glue holding the tyranny together, often required huge quantities of wood to burn the necessary lime for the mixture. This meant entire ancient forests were systematically clear-cut and destroyed, erasing the ancestral hunting grounds and resources of the English people, simultaneously building the prison and destroying the world they knew. The keep was an engineered island of Norman self-sufficiency. It included massive, deep wells drilled sometimes 100 feet down into the bedrock, providing an endless supply of fresh water, meaning they could withstand sieges that would utterly destroy the surrounding populace through thirst and famine. They were designed for perpetuity, impervious to simple siege tactics. But the keep, while terrifying, was only the beginning. The next evolution of Norman conquest would see the isolated tower expand into something far more complex, a multi-layered death trap designed not just to withstand attack, but to annihilate the attackers. In the next part, we rip open the sophisticated strategic plans, the complex, massive curtain walls and flanking towers that expanded the castle into a massive, multi-layered defensive machine, turning simple defense into an advanced art form of mass casualty warfare. The walls are about to get much, much bigger and far deadlier. The wood rotted, the earthworks settled, and the desperate Anglo-Saxon hope that this nightmare invasion was temporary died with them. William the Conqueror did not build temporary structures. He built monuments to his eternal rule. When the earth movers arrived, they didn't bring lumber. They brought the colossal, cold shock of dressed stone, thousands upon thousands of tons of it, hauled from quarries that bled the landscape dry. This wasn't just construction. It was a decree etched into the very soil of England. This was the era of the Stone Keep, the ultimate expression of totalitarian control. Imagine standing in the shadow of a structure so immense, so brutally symmetrical, that it seemed less like a building and more like a mountain that had been violently carved into a fortress. These towers were not meant to blend in. They were designed to shock, intimidate, and dwarf the surrounding populace into permanent submission. The keep was designed to be unassailable, yes, but its primary function was psychological. It was the absolute center of power, the visible, undeniable proof that resistance was futile. A massive, unmoving symbol that the Normans were here forever, and their rule was absolute. Look at the White Tower in London, begun within a decade of the conquest. Its walls are 15 feet thick at the base, built not just to repel siege engines, but to withstand the relentless assault of time itself. It dominates the skyline, a terrifying, geometric ghost haunting the city, a constant reminder to every soul who walked beneath it. We are here forever. The stone was imported, the design alien, the message clear. The entrance was never at ground level. You had to ascend a precarious external stairway, exposed and vulnerable, just to beg entry to the Lord's domain. This intentional elevation screamed hierarchy. It meant that even if an enemy breached the outer courtyard, they had to climb upward, step by exposed step, becoming perfect targets for archers in the upper floors. Every step up that stone stair was a physical lesson in obedience, a humiliation ritual disguised as architecture. The windows? Narrow slits, arrow loops, designed to let light in only grudgingly and to let death out instantly. The square design of these early keeps, like Rochester or Colchester, offered perfect visibility and terrifying rigidity. They were built like stone battering rams, pointed at the heart of the defeated nation.
But how do you build such a titan? The cost was paid in English sweat and blood. The logistical nightmare of moving those massive stones, some weighing multiple tons, was solved by the simplest, cruelest method: forced labor. Whole villages were displaced, sometimes destroyed, just to clear the path for the immense supply chains
that fed the ravenous Norman construction sites. Think of the thousands of oxen straining, the ropes snapping, the overseers whipping the defeated populace until the stones were hauled into place. The landscape was systematically stripped. Forests were leveled for scaffolding and fuel. Quarries became open wounds in the earth, exporting misery and bedrock across the ravaged land. The very air around a construction site reeked of limestone dust, fear, and relentless physical exhaustion. The men building these prisons were often the very men whose freedom these structures were designed to crush. Their hands laid the stones that cemented their own bondage. Inside the keep, life was a carefully calculated exercise in self-sufficiency and layered defense. Below ground level sat the crypt or basement, often windowless, perpetually damp, used for storage of vast quantities of food, and, more sinisterly, as a dungeon where English rebels disappeared forever. A few feet above the damp earth, the keep held enough supplies to withstand years of siege: salted meats, dried grains, barrels of ale. Crucially, every major keep had its own deep well, carved through bedrock, ensuring an independent supply of water, the most critical resource in any medieval conflict. To starve the Normans out was a difficult task. To thirst them out was nearly impossible, especially when the surrounding English peasantry had their own wells commandeered or poisoned by raiding parties. The floors above housed the great hall, the seat of judgment and power, and the Lord's private chambers, always situated at the highest, safest level, offering commanding views of the terrified world below, demonstrating absolute, unchallenged superiority. The stone revolution didn't stop with the simple, square keep. The ambition grew monstrous as the 12th century dawned. Take Dover Castle, the key to England, which became the greatest stone fortification of its age. Its central keep is a masterpiece of early structural engineering, massive and intimidating, but it introduced a new level of sophistication. Dover's keep incorporated internal structural dividing walls, making it essentially two keeps in one, preventing a single breach from destroying the entire structure, and allowing the defenders to retreat and hold secondary positions within the main tower. But soon, the Normans realized that even walls 15 feet thick could be breached if the outer defenses failed. Siege technology was advancing, and the sheer power of new stone-throwing machines demanded a terrifying counter-response. They began to wrap their central power in concentric rings of stone, walls within walls, ditches within ditches, creating death traps for any attacking force. The simple square keep evolved into a terrifying multi-stage citadel, each layer designed to inflict maximum casualties before the enemy even saw the true heart of the Lord's power. The outer bailey became a killing field, overlooked by towers that rained death from multiple angles. The architecture itself was weaponized. The introduction of flanking towers, round or D-shaped towers that projected out from a main curtain wall, eliminated blind spots, and allowed archers to unleash devastating, enfilading fire along the wall face, trapping attackers in a merciless crossfire. The art of war had moved beyond simple barricades. It was now a three-dimensional chess game, played with stone, steel, and endless streams of blood. The walls are no longer just passive barriers. They are active weapons, ready to crush any hope of English resurgence. The age of the unstoppable stone fortress was now fully upon the defeated kingdom, and the cost was measured in the very soul of the land. The fragile, desperate era of the wooden palisade was over. William the Conqueror was done playing games of temporary intimidation. His gaze now fell upon the earth with the chilling realization that to truly dominate England, he needed monuments that would outlast the very memory of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Structures that screamed eternity in cold, hard rock. The Norman strategy shifted from rapid assertion to permanent, crushing residency. And the architectural answer was a monolith of terror. What rose next was not merely a wall, but an unholy geometric titan, the Great Keep. Imagine the horror of the defeated populace as these colossal white or gray cubes, often standing over 90 feet tall, began to pierce the English skyline, appearing overnight like geologic tumors imposed by a hostile god. These keys were the ultimate psychological anchor, designed to crush morale not through a single siege, but through sheer, terrifying visibility. Every mile traveled, every field tilled, the peasant would see that immovable stone mass, that silent, judgmental tower, and remember exactly who owned the air they breathed. The keep was the heart of the Norman regime, broadcasting absolute, unyielding power across the conquered countryside. A brutal flag made entirely of mortar and insurmountable stone. But how? How did this massive architectural revolution materialize so quickly? It was built entirely on the broken backs of the conquered. The construction of a single great keep required unimaginable resources. Mountains of stone ripped violently from the earth, often shipped across the channel, or extracted through brutal forced labor in newly opened English quarries. The sheer scale of the operation turned entire districts into militarized labor camps. Picture thousands of men, women, and animals straining against massive blocks of fine cane stone, a prized material shipped directly from Normandy for maximum symbolic weight. Or the hard local grit, knowing that every muscle ache served imprisonment of their own homeland. This was no construction project. It was an act of economic and physical terrorism. The logistics involved diverting the entire productive capacity of the region, ensuring that the people spent their days building the walls of their own oppression, instead of cultivating resistance or feeding their families. The brilliance of the Norman engineers and their chilling cruelty lay in the dimensions of these structures. These were not delicate defenses. They were fortresses built with staggering overkill. We are talking about walls 15 to 20 feet thick at the base, impenetrable barriers capable of laughing off the crude incendiary arrows and the clumsy, desperate battering rams of the era.
Inside that overwhelming shell, the Norman lords lived in absolute, insulated safety, untouched by the chaos they had inflicted outside. The keep was the ultimate panic room, elevated high above the ground, usually accessible only by a steep external staircase that could be easily destroyed or defended by a handful of elite archers.
The entrance itself was often a treacherous maze of dead-end passages, layered portcullises, and hidden murder holes, chutes through which boiling liquids or heavy missiles could be dropped upon intruders. It was designed to ensure that even if a rebellion managed to breach the outer defenses, the heart of the fortress remained inviolable. The message was cold, precise, and absolute. You will never touch us. Consider the ultimate symbol of this sudden, brutal power shift, the White Tower of London. Begun in the 1070s, this behemoth was more than just a castle. It was a physical manifestation of William's absolute, crushing dominance over the former capital of the English kingdom. Its very foundations were laid upon the psychological ruins of the conquered city. Rising 4 imposing stories high, its walls are not just thick, they are a geological feature, dominating the skyline, where once the delicate political structures of the Anglo-Saxons stood. It served not just as a residence, but as a prison, an arsenal, and a treasury, the central nervous system of the conquering regime, visible for miles down the Thames. The very location was chosen to maximize psychological impact, overshadowing the ancient city and ensuring that every merchant, every citizen, and every nobleman who walked through London felt the cold, hard shadow of Norman authority upon their necks, a permanent threat carved in stone. For the English, the shift from attacking flimsy timber defenses to staring up at a towering stone cube was utterly demoralizing. Siege warfare became exponentially more complex, requiring resources and expertise the defeated lacked entirely. They had traded a quick, decisive battle for an endless, grinding impossibility. The Norman strategy wasn't just to win battles, it was to eliminate the possibility of future conflict. By building keeps that could withstand years of siege, they effectively bankrupted the concept of organized English resistance before it could even begin to muster the necessary tools, starving out any hope of rebellion long before the first stone was breached. The keep was the ultimate checkmate, requiring the English rebels to somehow invent technologies of war 100 years before they existed, or simply submit to the permanent fact of their subjugation. The land itself was now an enemy collaborator, supplying the unending stone that would forever bind the defeated populace to the will of the conqueror and his unstoppable, terrifying architectural legacy. The earth had given up its bounty, but tearing that bounty free required an effort that redefined human suffering, transforming every quarry into a forced labor camp of unimaginable misery. These were not mere stones, they were the petrified screams of the conquered landscape, dragged from pits sometimes 50 miles distant, marking every muddy track and every newly cut Roman road with the ceaseless, agonizing friction of heavy chains and the unending, desperate strain of human muscle.
For the defeated English, life had instantly devolved into a nightmarish, Sisyphean task. Imagine the scene. Thousands of defeated men, their previous lives as free farmers, smiths, or tradesmen obliterated, now harnessed like oxen, pulling massive blocks that weighed more than a dozen men combined up slick, dangerous inclines.
The Norman overseers, speaking a harsh, alien tongue that few understood, used the whip not just as punishment, but as a cruel metronome, setting the frantic, relentless pace of subjugation, ensuring that every drop of sweat served the glory of the conqueror. The sheer logistical madness of moving hundreds of thousands of tons of material, some chalky cane stone imported from across the channel, others rugged local limestone, was a deliberate, open display of overwhelming organizational power. They didn't just build, they demanded that the very foundations of the land submit to the monumental weight of their ambition. Hauling stones required sophisticated systems of rollers, capstans, and complex wooden ramps, often failing catastrophically and crushing the unfortunate souls tethered beneath the massive weight, turning the construction site into a gruesome open grave. This back-breaking, soul-crushing effort was all aimed at one singular, terrifying architectural goal, the Great Stone Keep. These weren't castles, they were geological interventions, monuments to eternal ownership, towering impossibilities that mocked the very notion of revolt.
Look at the White Tower in London, standing nearly 90 feet tall, with walls that stretch over 100 feet long on each side. Or the colossal, overwhelming structure at Rochester, or the dominating, strategic presence of Dover Castle. Each was a calculated insult, a permanent, physical declaration that the game was over, forever.
These keeps were designed less for siege defense, though they were virtually impenetrable to the technology of the time, and more for psychological intimidation on an unprecedented scale. Their walls, often 15 feet thick at the base, did not just enclose space, they entombed absolute power, creating an artificial mountain of human and architectural dominance. The sheer verticality was essential. They were meant to be seen from every corner of the newly controlled territory, floating above the horizon like the stone embodiment of God's or William's cold, uncompromising judgment. To build these behemoths, William imported an entirely new breed of artisan, the Norman master masons. These were not the rustic, local stoneworkers familiar with simple rubble construction.
They were highly specialized architects and engineers, armed with revolutionary knowledge of ashlar stonework. Ashlar meant perfectly cut, squared blocks, meticulously fitted so tightly that you often couldn't slip a knife blade between them, a technique that signaled technological and cultural superiority over the defeated Saxons.
This precise, expensive work ensured not only stability, but also a visual smoothness and imposing perfection that shouted wealth and permanence. The keep was the ultimate headquarters, the physical anchor of the new regime, designed to withstand not years, but centuries.
Deep within those impervious walls were the chapel, symbolizing William's divine, unchallenged right to rule. The massive great hall, where the new, harsh Norman justice was brutally dispensed, and the private chambers, safe havens for the ruling elite, positioned hundreds of feet above the miserable reality of the conquered streets below, insulated by stone and height.
Every inch of the structure was a calculated display of hierarchy and control. From the lowest, damped dungeon used for holding dangerous rebels, to the dizzying height of the battlements, which offered the Norman lord a panoramic, proprietary view of his stolen land. Even the seemingly innocent details were weaponized with deadly precision. Take the famous spiral staircases, for instance. Almost universally, they ascended in a tight, protective, clockwise direction. Why? Because a right-handed defender, stationed at the top of the stairs, could swing his sword freely and powerfully into the void, while any attacking force, forced to hug the central pillar, would have their movement and striking power severely restricted by the stone core. This small detail alone saved countless Norman lives and cost countless Saxon ones. And surrounding this invincible stone heart lay the crucial second layer of defense, the moat. These were not just convenient muddy ditches. They were engineered obstacles of immense scale, often wide and deep enough to swallow entire houses and their contents, sometimes requiring the intentional diversion of rivers or the careful management of existing floodplains to maintain a permanent, lethal barrier of water, sometimes spiked with sharpened stakes hidden just beneath the surface. To enter the castle was to submit to a gauntlet of intimidation that began long before the walls. It started with the bridge and the gatehouse. The gatehouse itself rapidly evolved from a simple wooden door to a complex, multi-layered death trap, a towering structure complete with murder holes, machicolations, through which boiling water, hot sand, or heavy stones could be dropped. Multiple deadly portcullises, heavy spiked iron gates designed to crush, and observation towers that glared down on the approaching supplicant with stone eyes. For the Saxon peasant, this entire terrifying complex was not a place of refuge or shelter. It was the impenetrable seat of eternal, unyielding fear. Every perfectly cut stone shouted, "You do not belong here. You serve." Every ripple in the moat whispered of drowning and finality. The massive scale was designed not just to stop an army, but to obliterate the very will of the people to even contemplate organized resistance against such monumental power. They didn't just see a fortress, they saw a permanent, unforgiving monument to their own devastating defeat and the unshakable might of the invaders. The age of the quick, temporary wooden fort was dead, rotting beneath the immense pressure of new construction. The age of the eternal, colossal stone behemoth, the ultimate weaponized architecture, designed for centuries of absolute control, had arrived, reshaping the English countryside into a militarized zone of absolute, uncompromising Norman dominance, a landscape forever hijacked by stone.
The transition from earthwork and flimsy timber palisades to solid, towering stone was not merely an upgrade, it was an industrial revolution fueled by terror, logistics, and the agonizing forced labor of the defeated English population. When William the Conqueror decreed that the makeshift wooden scars dotting the conquered lands must be replaced by monuments of eternal stone, he was, in effect, signing the death warrant for thousands of forced laborers.
This wasn't simple building. This was the methodical, agonizing extraction of the very soul of the island, and its transformation into unyielding, uncompromising granite. The scale of the operation defies modern imagination, demanding resources and manpower that dwarfed anything the Saxons had ever conceived. To construct a single central tower, like the one that would eventually dominate London, the infamous White Tower, required millions of cubic feet of heavy material, each piece handled by straining, desperate hands.
Where did this mountain of stone come from? It was ripped from the earth, often miles away, sometimes even shipped across the treacherous English Channel from Caen, France, specifically because its pale, durable quality communicated an unmistakable message. This power is foreign, invincible, and financed by absolute plunder.
The sheer logistics of moving these massive blocks were a nightmare of human and animal suffering, a testament to the ruthless efficiency of the new regime. Picture the scene. Hundreds of men, often English slaves, straining against thick ropes, hauling sledges weighed down with tons of cold, unforgiving rock. The air was thick with sweat, dust, and the ever-present sting of the Norman overseer's whip. Every single foot of progress was paid for in blood, broken bones, and the silent, grinding despair of a conquered people, forced to build their own prison. They weren't just constructing walls, they were constructing an impossible, terrifying myth of Norman strength, brick by agonizing, back-breaking brick. And when those colossal stones finally arrived at the building site, the true spectacle of architectural cruelty began.
These colossal stone keeps, the central nervous system of the entire conquest project, were designed not merely to withstand a siege for a few fleeting months, but to mock the very passage of time itself, to stand for 1,000 years as symbols of foreign rule.
The walls were not just thick, they were often 15 feet thick at the base, solid, impenetrable masonry that scoffed at even the most determined attempts at sapping or battering. A projectile striking these giants felt like a pebble hitting a mountain. The entrance, always the most vulnerable point in any fortress, was strategically elevated, often 20 or 30 feet above ground level, accessed only by a precarious, detachable wooden staircase that could be instantly retracted. This design choice instantly turned the towering keep into an unapproachable stone island, surrounded by a psychological moat of impossibility. To even hope to reach the Norman Duke, the attacker first had to climb to his level, often under a concentrated hail of arrows, stones, and boiling liquid. A chilling, literal metaphor for the impossibility of successfully challenging the new regime. Inside the stony, unyielding shell, the Normans established a chilling geography of power, meticulously dividing the space into spheres of dominance and suffering. The lower floors were deliberately dark, windowless crypts, perfect for stable storage, but more importantly, perfect for the deep, silent dungeons. These subterranean chambers were where resistance was systematically, painfully broken, where the very foundations of Norman power rested upon the muffled screams echoing in the darkness below, unheard by the world above. Directly above this horrifying base sat the Great Hall, a space of magnificent, deliberate theater. It was here, surrounded by opulent imported textiles, gleaming armor, and roaring fires, that the Norman lord would hold court, dispensing justice and demonstrating the rich spoils of their victory. The contrast was a calculated psychological weapon. Opulence and warmth for the conqueror, unimaginable, lightless hell for the conquered, all contained within the same unbreachable granite fortress. This was control engineered at the micro level. Take the White Tower itself, William's ultimate declaration of permanence, towering nearly 90 feet high, making it instantly visible for miles. A gleaming, terrifying lighthouse of oppression, standing sentinel over the defeated city of London. Its sophisticated design, including corner towers that weren't quite identical, a subtle asymmetry designed to give maximum fields of fire and confuse any attacker, was a signature of ruthless Norman efficiency honed over centuries of continental warfare. They built not just defensibility, but total, unquestionable dominance into the very geometry of the structure. The tower's walls, riddled with narrow, splayed windows, known as loopholes, ensured maximum light in for the archers and minimum visibility out for the enemy, creating a fatal one-way visibility. Every single architectural choice was a calculated military decision, transforming a simple building into an active, aggressive instrument of governance. It was a machine for ruling, carved from the very bones of the earth, designed to function perpetually.
The arrival of these titanic stone keeps meant there was no escape, no temporary retreat, no comforting hope that the foreign invaders might eventually pack up their flimsy wooden structures and leave. Stone meant forever.
It meant that the laws, the language, the very bloodlines of England were now indelibly stained by the conquest, encased in unforgiving granite. This was not a temporary occupation. This was a complete structural replacement of one civilization by another, sealed in blocks of unmoving, eternal rock.
The Norman stone keep was the ultimate, inescapable proof that the Saxon world had ended, swallowed whole by the towering shadow of the stone giant. The only choice left for the English populace was absolute, immediate submission, or a futile, painful death against an unyielding 15-foot thick wall of Norman power. Submission was granted, yes, but to the Norman Duke, mere submission was a temporary inconvenience, not a final solution. William demanded permanence, an architectural declaration of dynasty so overwhelming that it would silence dissent for 1,000 years. He demanded a monument so enormous, so utterly unyielding, that even the ghosts of Saxon resistance would be too terrified to haunt its shadows. This was the true, terrifying dawn of the great stone keep, and nowhere was this brutal ambition more shockingly realized than on the banks of the mighty Thames, where the Tower of London began its terrifying ascent. The colossal structure known as the White Tower did not merely happen. It erupted from the earth like a geological disaster engineered by a vengeful god. Its construction was less a building project and more a sustained act of national humiliation, requiring thousands of defeated English laborers forced to excavate the foundations under the watchful eyes of ruthless Norman overseers. Every man was treated as an expendable tool, driven to exhaustion by engineers who knew that their duke's patience was shorter than a hangman's rope. The foundation stone was laid not just on bedrock, but on the freshly crushed spirit of a conquered kingdom.
Every single block of Kentish ragstone, every massive, creamy piece of fine constone imported across the treacherous English Channel from Normandy was a physical weight pressing down on the neck of the occupied nation. The logistics of this operation were the nightmare fuel of the 11th century.
How do you move stones weighing several tons each, miles from the quarry, without modern machinery? The answer was agonizingly simple, terrifyingly cruel, and profoundly effective. Sheer, relentless, back-breaking, human misery. Teams of oxen strained, ropes snapped, men died beneath crushing loads, their bodies discarded and replaced instantly. But the work never stopped. It was a dark production line of subjugation, where the materials for the new empire were cemented not just with mortar, but with the blood and the broken will of the vanquished population.
The keep was not just a building. It was the definitive three-dimensional projection of the Duke's iron will. Its design was a stratified hierarchy of power, with every level dedicated to reinforcing the absolute dominion of the foreign lord.
The lower levels were cold, dark, and purely functional. Deep storage for provisions and armories of cruel iron weapons, essential for any prolonged siege. But crucially, these levels also housed the terrifying, lightless abyss of the dungeons, reserved for those foolhardy enough to whisper dissent against the regime.
Rising above this foundation of fear was the sprawling, echoing expanse of the great hall, the castle's true nerve center, where justice, always Norman justice, was dispensed with brutal, uncompromising efficiency.
This was the high drama stage where the Norman lord, seated upon a throne that symbolized his military and divine authority, turned local disputes into exercises in foreign domination, reminding the English exactly who held the power of life and death.
The architecture itself demanded reverence and silence. Then, higher still, far removed from the stench of the common folk and the endless clatter of the guards, were the private chambers, the solar.
These were havens of calculated isolation and luxury, shielded by massive walls and accessible only by narrow, heavily guarded stairs. They were designed specifically to emphasize the insurmountable social and political distance between the conqueror and the permanently conquered. But perhaps the most insidious, the most psychologically devastating feature of these monolithic structures was the chapel. Within the very heart of the keep, protected by walls thicker than any man was tall, the Normans established their spiritual beachhead. Look upon St. John's Chapel, hidden deep within the White Tower, a masterpiece of severe, imposing Romanesque architecture. This was not a place of comfort or gentle prayer. It was a visible, stone testament to the divine right of the conqueror. Every prayer recited in Latin, every hymn sung by the foreign clergy, was a declaration that God himself had sanctioned William's bloody land grab. The very architecture preached a sermon of permanent subjugation. The lord of the castle was the lord by heaven's mandate, and the English had been justly abandoned. The natives, watching the keep rise, understood this message acutely. Their own humble parish churches were now dwarfed, overshadowed, and made irrelevant by these concrete pillars of foreign faith, proving, in the terrifying logic of the 11th century, that their ancestral God had definitively turned his face away. We must look deeper still into the architecture of dread, specifically the horrifying invention of the oubliette. Derived from the French verb meaning to forget, this was not a simple cell. It was a black hole of memory, a place designed not just for punishment, but for absolute, metaphysical erasure. Dropping a man down a narrow, often bottle-shaped chute into a pitch-dark, ventilation-starved pit meant removing him from the world entirely.
stripping him of identity, sunlight, and the very concept of time. It was the architectural embodiment of the Norman decree: resist, and you cease to exist, not just legally, but as a memory in the minds of the living. It generated a pervasive, crippling, systemic fear that filtered down from the battlements into every village, every field, ensuring compliance with far fewer physical garrisons than would otherwise be necessary.
These stone giants, the keeps of Rochester, the colossal structure at Norwich, the towering fortress of Dover, and the terrible White Tower, stood as permanent geological scars on the English landscape. They were the living organisms of oppression, always watching, always demanding tribute, always whispering the threat of the oubliette to any who thought of rising up. The castle became the administrative center, the economic hub, the military headquarters, and the ultimate judicial executioner.
Every single aspect of English life, from the tax on the harvest to the contract for a marriage, now flowed through the stone, unfeeling heart of the Norman regime. The age of the weak, temporary wooden fort was utterly dead.
In its place stood an eternal, unyielding stone leviathan, a silent dictator whose reign was enforced by walls 15 feet thick, signaling a tyranny that would last for centuries. But even these formidable keeps, designed to last forever, held a hidden, fatal vulnerability, a secret strain in their foundations that the English would one day desperately try to exploit.